Battlefront 2 rode the tail end of a wave of Star Wars games that defined not only the golden age of Star Wars video games, but arguably gaming itself. Battlefront 2, meanwhile, was a microtransaction-riddled mess endemic of the 8th console generation, all parts an expression of greed and cynicism. Where do you start with something like this? I mean, the name itself is pretty funny. I do not miss the era of naming your new games something old in order to cash in on nostalgia and, more importantly, SEO heat. Someone looking up some game they remember fondly and having the search engine offer free advertising for the new game, which is automatically better because of its new graphics. That's not true, but there are people out there who think that way. I mean, how do you not compare 2017 to 2005? It literally stole Battlefront 2005's name. You know how some logos have really obnoxious trademarking in them? Well, how many times have you ever seen a logo that puts the name of the publisher, not any of the developers, but the publisher, into the logo? Is the fact that EA is in the title supposed to draw me in? How could that possibly be a selling point, other than the idea that cons lists technically are also made up of points? Am I supposed to look forward to the legendary management practices of Electronic Arts? But how is the game? Well, that's a complicated question because you have to ask, which version? The version the public got on launch is far different than the one you can play today. From late 2017 through early 2020, the game kept getting updates, adding more and fixing up weak parts. In late 2019, they released the Celebration Edition, which basically killed the last surviving elements of the original microtransaction system. These scars are still there, these pointless challenges and currencies and even the occasional crate with colored loot you open for unlocking milestones. There's a lot of time wasting in this game for a system that's now gone, but there doesn't seem to be anywhere I'm expected to slot in a credit card anymore, not even for the DLC. This is in stark contrast to the launch version. People playing pre-release copies discovered a number of issues. It was projected you would have to grind for 40 hours just to unlock a single hero. The star card progression was basically pay to win, with paying players getting access to powerful augments that other less paying customers who simply bought the $60 video game would have to grind for. It was so controversial, EA initially disabled the system with plans to re-implement it later once they reworked it. But it was too little, too late, and EA lost billions in stock value during this period. It was so bad several governments began investigating loot boxes as gambling, citing Battlefront 2 as a motivating example. If you've noticed the industry has moved away from loot boxes to battle passes, you can thank Electronic Arts in part for that. In 2020, the creative director stated that the game is complete. This was while the studio was actively working on releasing additional heroes like Ahsoka Tano, and there were many actually canon characters still notably absent. Just a small jest. But yeah, since the game is complete, I guess whatever balance and features the game has are forever. Post-launch patching is part of what makes covering modern games frustrating, but that is a core part of the DICE cycle. The Battlefield series has been doing this for a long time. They announce a new game, it ends up a broken mess or feature incomplete. The game gets fixed over the course of several years and eventually gets considered to be underrated by YouTube commenters. And so the cycle continues. Why do people like this game? Well, it starts with the visuals. DICE has always been a company that puts spectacle first, and I will admit that the game is good at that. If you compared what Battlefront 2005 was offering the year it came out versus what 2017 offers to us today, yeah, it's definitely an improvement. My favorite detail is that when a blaster shot hits snow, it sizzles from the snow melting. Troopers running through the mud get filthy, corresponding appropriately to whatever environment they are fighting in. Snow will stick to cloth, and just look at Camino.
Secure the area.
But graphical fidelity is not everything. What people want out of these games is, of course, gameplay. It's cool to see Star Wars characters fighting it out, but you could already get that experience back in 2005. You still can. I suppose the most natural place is to start with health and ammo, which are both infinite and recharging.
This is treason.
Okay. Maybe I said that in the worst possible way. Ammo is infinite now, but they added a heat mechanic to the weapons. They heat up as you shoot and need to cool down, working similar to a reload. But you have the option to speed that process up and even enter a state where you get free shots without building additional heat. I really like this mechanic, because it makes the actual act of shooting people more engaging. People get distracted trying to time their cooldowns, and that creates opportunities to advance. It is like a car driving game with a manual transmission. Without it, it just becomes holding down the accelerator and moving through the environment. With it, the simple act of getting from place to place has the mini game of shifting the gears. It does come at a cost, though. Without any kind of ammo system, there is nothing stopping someone from sitting in a position indefinitely. In 2005, engineers had to play the important role of getting supplies to troopers. If teams didn't have this, parts of the defensive line could break. And most importantly, it gave something for your girlfriend to do when she tried to play with you. You really feel the lack of an ammo system on any map that makes use of heavy choke points. Health is also infinite and recharging, which leads to the usual problems with hiding in place and waiting. But given there is a more engaging system also requiring you to wait in place, it's fine. And there's a health bar. Yes, my expectations were that low. It even tells you a number. The number's really smart because how much health a character has immediately tells you how you're supposed to play that character. While I do lament the loss of health and ammo droids, engineers, and the mechanics therein, it is a system that was replaced with something that still creates the necessary push and pull dynamics of a Battlefront. I think it should be said that the game is not what I imagined, which was Battlefield with a Star Wars texture pack layered on top of it. DICE has actually set aside their usual tropes to deliver an emulation of Pandemic's original design vision with Battlefront. Like 2005, there are 4 class archetypes. Obviously, these have changed given what I just said. The base soldier is still there, but the heavy class has become a gunner rather than a rocket trooper. The engineer has been replaced with an officer class, basically taking the officer mechanics from the Empire and putting that in every faction. And the last class is just a sniper. Well, it's both classic and a DICE staple, so it's to be expected. Classes are universal, even more so than in 2005. Droid soldiers don't get rockets like they used to. This leads to a more consistent experience, which is important considering there are now 6 factions. You can unlock the higher tier classes through battle points, which operate like a mid-match currency. So, instead of having to compete with your teammates for clone commander slots, now you just have to do well on the battlefield and earn points by either playing objectives or getting kills. These reinforcement characters do set the factions apart, but have similar ideas to keep things simple. Enforcers are tanks, aerial units are really fun, and infiltrators are there too. For more battle points, you can unlock vehicles, which can be a bit of a mixed bag, as well as hero units. Competition for heroes is low because of how expensive they are. The battle point system makes sure you actually rotate class types and give other people the chance to play those powerful characters. You may have noticed that I'm actually playing multiplayer, which is not something I've done for the channel before. I did clock a lot of time in the single player, but the reason I bring this up is I did not try to assess Battlefront 2005 as a multiplayer game, purely as the single player game it is. Part of that is that DICE made this a multiplayer game, which, makes sense. I just want to make sure people are clear that most of the single player content was released years after the fact. On launch, you had to play single player in a mode called Arcade, just to sell that it was old-fashioned to be playing by yourself. Which is funny because arcades were actually social environments. Instant action wouldn't be properly added until August of 2019, and even the current iteration with options came in an update. I already hate having to try and figure out what content existed when, like the fact that Anakin Skywalker was added in a content update in 2018, or that he was absolutely broken on launch. So what is there to do? Well, we can play Galactic Conquest. Sorry, we can play some guy's interpretation of Galactic Conquest. EA never actually tried to get anyone to make this officially a thing, which is actually funny considering how relatively simple the strategy part of Galactic Conquest is. It is just a way to play instant action with some additional stakes for winning and losing. True to form, the garrison bonus is the most powerful ability in this mode. I never saw the AI try to use it, and eventually I stopped using it because it was sad just how big an advantage you would get for how cheap it is. See, the main game mode switched from running ticket counters down to gaining points via controlling more command posts. So the garrison bonus, instead of giving you more tickets, just gives you 10 more dudes. That said, because this is not officially part of the game itself doesn't have enough mechanics to make the bonuses actually work. Examples would be bonuses that affect both teams, such as decreasing the rate a team earns battle points. Some other oddities. All the galaxy maps are donuts, unlike the original where the original era map was a crescent shape. If you win a space battle, you take over the planet. This was in stark contrast to how it worked in 2005, where parking a fleet over a planet basically gave you 2 chances to defend it. The space battles are also terrible, so the strategy has changed from using space battles to defend difficult maps to avoiding space battles like the plague. Yeah, EA had Criterion replace the 2005 space battles of boarding, bombing, and dogfighting with a mode that just has dogfighting. The worst mistake I made was using a garrison bonus in this mode, which calls for you to increase the ticket counter, which proportionally just increases the amount of time it takes to inevitably win. There are also a lot less ground maps. Some of that makes sense. Some of the old maps, mostly from the prequel era, were never added to 2017. But Bespin is in the game, albeit in arcade, but still. I'm not sure why it isn't used in the Rebel era of Galactic Conquest. You also can't play any map as any faction, which limits things. It's also worth noting that the core game mode of Conquest has been replaced with Supremacy. Maps are basically just hourglass shapes with each corner being an objective. You score if you control more than the opposing team. Not all maps are equal though, especially with how simple the AI is. I mean, the 2005 AI was also simple, but it could play the objective. Half the droids on Camino just hang out and spawn, but don't let that give you the idea that they're defending those objectives. Sometimes my AI teammates would refuse to capture one of the starter objectives while I rushed mid, and so we would start off losing because nobody ever went to E. And on Endor, I lost because the AI couldn't figure out that all of the enemies were up on the 2nd floor. This was actually after about 10 minutes of a stalemate because the Empire could not figure out that the Rebels were on the 1st floor. These rooms are connected, by the way. And the First Order campaign is hilarious. The 3 Resistance planets are sitting in a row right next to your spawn, while their fleet is halfway across the map. If you can win all 3 battles, you can beat the Resistance before they even have a chance to attack you. This happened right before my CIS campaign, which was the worst because of how badly my team performed on Camino. All in all, Galactic Conquest for 2017 is really weak. You can't buy units anymore, half of the bonuses affect both teams, and even just as a way to play instant action, it still wasn't ideal. I appreciate the attempt, don't get me wrong, it's just embarrassing that an official mode was never actually added to the game. So let's talk about something 2017 does have that 2005 did not. Co-op. Oh, sorry. That was also added in an update. What was actually in this game prior to all the content updates? Co-op is a 4-player mode, and for being stapled on, it's not as bad as those modes tend to be. The fact that you can always find people for this mode when the servers aren't down kind of says that this is a unique draw that 2017 has. The flaws of the AI are surmountable when you have 3 human players, but it's not always a stomp fest. You can also level your multiplayer characters in co-op, which prevents multiplayer from becoming a hellhole where high-level sweaties with maxed out characters slaughter new players. Plus, there was a triple XP event that saw me maxing out most of the characters in the game in one day. There are star cards which augment your abilities and properties. While this is an advantage other players will hold over you for a while, it's not the worst thing ever. It's also not terribly different from the buffs 2005 gave players for kill streaks. And it does actually add more class dynamics. I think it's only a problem with hero characters, since the only way to reliably play those characters to level them is in heroes versus villains, which is sweaty central. In single player, all the cards are already maxed out. On the one hand, that means people of the future playing this game when the central servers have been taken offline won't have to worry about leveling up their characters. Yeah, that's one of the many elephants in the herd currently crowding the room. Even Battlefront 2005 was dead for a while. With no microtransactions, there's even more incentive than normal for EA to cut the service if they feel a slow influx of new players no longer justifies hosting the game. As neat as the co-op is, I suggest not forming too many attachments to playing it, given there is no official end-of-life plan for Battlefront 2017. There is apparently a way to play on private servers, complete with mods though, so no game's ever truly gone. Now that I have mentioned 3 of the elephants, let's mention the 4th, Disney. Disney bought Star Wars a decade ago, and they are thankfully lazy when it comes to their franchises and video games. They decided instead to license the games out. Unfortunately, the recipient of this license was Electronic Arts. Disney has been, slightly controversial in their handling of Star Wars. Let's just say that it fits that the First Order Enforcer has a flamethrower given how badly the sequel trilogy burned down. I guess I should be grateful though. I doubt I would have my silver play button if The Last Jedi hadn't been bad enough to make multiple genres of videos on YouTube popular. Something that seems to confuse commenters is why people like myself like the prequel era. It's not because I liked the movies. God no. Revenge of the Sith is not an underrated gem. I think it's just rated. You can like an era of Star Wars independent of your opinion on the films they came from. I like the First Order. The Resistance sucks. Sure, they're both reskins of the original factions, but the factions getting reskinned were good, so who cares that we get more?
Are you offering me a job?
Oh no, Rey has so few iconic lines that she says something completely context inappropriate because that's all she has. Even the prequel heroes don't have that problem.
Perfect.
No, not perfect, Rey. Lost.
Something notable about the game is that it is a big fan of the Clone Wars. That sets it apart from Battlefront 2005. Most of the canon established in that show didn't exist yet, so in the original 2005 campaign, the clones were aware of Order 66, which I actually prefer, but also stated to have become stormtroopers, which I don't prefer. 2017 is packed with Clone Wars references, including the slurs.
This should be an easy one for a bunch of fearsome clanker crushers like you.
That said, the comedic tone of the Clone Wars also comes across. The clones make jokes in most of their battle dialogue, whereas 2005 was a tonally serious game.
Is it me, or is Geonosian orange not really the Seppi's color?
All that breeding, all those years of training, it doesn't really prepare you for all the screaming or the blood, does it? Frankly, I'm still amazed we ever made it through the first hour. Never mind the first day.
2017, for all of its post-launch updates, also never got around to adding the Mandalorian, not even as an optional skin for Boba Fett. In fact, there are a lot of missing characters such as Jango Fett, Mace Windu, or ground versions of Poe Dameron and Hux. It seems strange that the decision was made to basically drop Battlefront 2017, but never follow it up with a genuine Battlefront 3. I guess the curse is real. That, or someone at EA, is salty. Vader! Vader! What the fuck is going on down here? 2005's campaign was a story that followed the 501st Legion, the clone troopers assigned to Anakin Skywalker. It starts at the final battle of Attack of the Clones, follows all of the battles in the movies, including a bit detailing the transition to the Imperial government, and continues on until ending at the Battle for Hoth. When it comes to making a Star Wars game, this is a really good format to use. It makes efficient usage of existing levels and meshes with the combat mechanics of the games to tell the story of regular soldiers. Other examples would have to be the campaign following the events of the movies from the perspective of the main characters. This would require more assets to be created, whereas the 2005 campaign was smart about using things already built for the game itself and its storytelling. The last option is to create an original story, and that is what they went with. Don't get me wrong, it's a valid option that did work for a few games. The first red flag is the premise. We are Imperial Special Forces, set during Return of the Jedi and following the story until the end of the war. At first, I didn't get why this particular time period, until I realized what story they were trying to tell. That, of course, being to fill in details between the original and sequel trilogy. So obviously, we need to set up our defection to the rebels as fast as possible. This means the game doesn't really utilize the prequel era, which makes sense when you consider how much of that era was added post-launch. Another thing to consider is that the gameplay was done by DICE, while the Starfighter gameplay was done by Criterion. So Motive, a company created pretty much to make this campaign, is at the mechanical mercy of other studios working on Battlefront 2017. The most notable aspect of this is that there's no dodge roll in the campaign. The reason this is significant is that I would consider it pretty hard to tell a video game story when the video game is entirely out of your own control. Another factor is that the main character has to be both Special Forces and an ace pilot to complement both aspects of the multiplayer game. Now, that wasn't a problem with 2005. After all, there isn't really a main character of that story. There's no question the character I'm playing at that moment is qualified to pilot or drive tanks or shoot sniper rifles. They even address training in the cutscenes. But you stack all of those attributes onto a single named character, as well as adding a remorseless kill count in the process. That is a recipe for pacing issues when we switch sides. I don't think the game earned a betrayal sequence, and it is shocking how fast all those dead rebels gets put behind us. This lack of mechanical input also means that the campaign can't serve as an extended tutorial for multiplayer mechanics. The MC doesn't even play like their multiplayer counterpart, which was actually surprisingly fun. I doubt many people could even tell though, given how few people seem to have started up the campaign, let alone finished it, or even played them in multiplayer. Their defection comes at the requirement of the Empire doing something really bizarre, namely Operation Cinder. Now, deciding to glass your own planets as a logical plan, assuming the guy doing it's a spiteful prick who is dead. But have you heard of The Last Jedi? In the effort of pulling the sequel trilogy out of a flat spin, the Emperor had to be resurrected in Episode 9. Really sells how stupid that is, considering there's a mission in this game where we fly around the destroyed wreck of the Death Star. Palpatine's plan in Disney's canon doesn't make sense to me. It did in the EU. The Death Star wasn't just a toy to inspire fear, but also a weapon to use against an incoming extragalactic enemy. Why would a guy who risked his life on several occasions to try and convert people to the dark side have a backup plan like this in the event of his death? If he can just get resurrected into a new body, then why does he care about dying? That is, of course, making the big assumption that Palpatine was even supposed to be in Episode 9 when this game was being developed. Hey, remember when all those people told me the Emperor would never blow up Theed for disloyalty because, I think the problem with new Star Wars is that it is uninterested in taking its time trying to lay out its story, and it has grand aspirations that it is woefully under-equipped for. It says a lot when the more personal, grounded stories like The Mandalorian have been far more successful than the stories that revolve around planet annihilation and the greatest force to ever be assembled since the last time that happened. Operation Cinder isn't happening to accentuate the world building, it's solely for the pathos of seeing how these characters react to what is happening. It is grounds to have Imperial loyalists be not so loyal anymore. Which could be interesting if the game had gone full force with being an Imperial agent. It does not. Granted, it didn't have time for that, which makes the ambition of the story concerning. You have 4 hours of time in which you need to establish the Emperor's plan, why it makes sense, why all these officers are cool with it, etc. But also, you have to do character stuff with your main cast. And also, you need to make time for original trilogy characters to have their own character moments within this plot. This turns the storyline into a structural mess. The 4th mission, for instance, begins with a 20-second cutscene establishing why one of the characters in the squad needs to go off on their own to some random location before suddenly jumping into the head of Luke Skywalker at that location. And because said squad member went alone, they have their motivations in the betrayal set. Other than the pacing, all well and good, and even using Luke Skywalker in that scene to create that moment is fine. But then they have to establish that Luke got the map that was central to the early sequel trilogy here, years in advance of his decision to murder his nephew and become a milk-drinking hermit. Why? So that the main character can have a vestigial connection to Kylo Ren in the ending and try and tie this to the sequel trilogy. The story is trying its hardest to tie together Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens into a cohesive narrative that just isn't possible because The Force Awakens is predicated on either missing information or dubious assumptions. I do not envy having to be the professional script doctor trying to force these stories to mesh together, which is why I would advocate just ignoring them. The original characters are also somewhat sequelized in their portrayal here. Han Solo, for instance, is reintroduced as a reckless deadbeat, presumably before he even had his son with Leia. Does that work in service of connecting Episode 6 and Episode 7, Han? I guess. Although the mission would rather spend time making fun of Star Wars fans than anything else.
No way! That's Han Solo! Look! Stop staring. Pretend he's not there. Oh, he sees us.
97% of blaster shots? Now, to your famous Falcon.
You know the Falcon?
Yeah. On average, I'd say 2.2 of every 300 Imperials knows the Millennium Falcon.
It's Chewbacca! This YG-1300 freighter you've got is something, but its hyperdrive fails 1.22 times more often than the 2400 Falcon. Chewie, get him out of my cockpit. No, wait, I'll behave.
Leia has been turned into a motivational poster template, always going on about the hope meme. Luke is a somewhat passive beta male, as to fit his characterization in The Last Jedi, and Lando has been turned into a gambling addict, as to fit his characterization in the Han Solo movie. Let's contrast that with how something like Jedi Outcast did similar scenes. In Outcast, Luke is portrayed as an active figure who's going on his own adventure parallel with Katarn, with the occasional intersection in order to establish both exposition and an outsider's observation on Kyle Katarn's character arc through the story. Because Outcast isn't beholden to cramming itself in the cracks of other narratives, it's able to keep Luke accurate to his original depictions instead of trying to show the roots of his transformation into Jake Skywalker. However, that is almost completely irrelevant, because the decision was made for this to be an original story about new characters, so any time being spent focusing on old characters has to fit into the new framework, and here it doesn't. This causes the story to struggle to really be about anything. It fails to give us a new perspective on Imperial culture, or about what the New Republic actually did that led to them being so weak in the sequels. And it doesn't really try to connect the films together as much as I may have implied. It just lays the groundwork for the character assassinations to come. Even the characters established in this story eventually get killed off, a meta Operation Cinder likely ordered by EA, aimed at ensuring that this story dies here. This was done in an unusually charitable free LC for the game, Resurrections. That would be charitable, if it didn't seem like a cleaner tying up loose ends. This takes place during the sequel era, and while it has a really interesting mission in a bombed-out city being fought over by two hostile factions, it's otherwise as equally irrelevant as its parent story, especially since you have to complete the original campaign to play it anyways. That is a lot of tedium just to get one interesting level idea that honestly should have been made into a multiplayer map instead. Post-Cinder Vardos is what the game should have been offering originally. Not turret sequences and dumb betrayal scenes. Interesting gameplay sequences where the consequences of events are shown through world building. I mean, come on, 4 blaster shots to kill the main character? But you know the rules. No body, no death. Okay, so I've been pretending Del Moro is the main character in editing, but it's actually this person who also dies to a blaster shot to the gut, in case you didn't believe me when I said that they're shuffling to get her out. Iden Versio is an oft-criticized character, and not for being a female and vaguely ethnic. The primary criticism that she actually receives is just how quickly she defects to the rebellion, in a story that was billed as an Empire POV. And of course, naturally, that's because of the films. The writers needed her to switch sides because at that point Lucasfilm had no idea what the fuck was going on with the First Order, and Motive was not allowed to establish anything that would contradict the movies. The great thing about Battlefront 2005 was that it was bridging the then-new Revenge of the Sith with films that had already existed for decades. And LucasArts was a lot better about coordinating these things to ensure that any writer could tell any story without these kinds of arbitrary edicts. It's not surprising, though. The modern film industry is a mess of people flying by the seat of their pants, regardless of the consequences that has for any company below theirs in the totem pole that actually needs them to have things like plans and basic ideas about their settings. This game was bitterly at the mercy of many different financial interests that didn't know what they were doing. That's why they have so desperately relied on novels to fill in the gaps, because they're more flexible in their adaptability for post-hoc canon explanations. You can write out a book explaining things faster and easier than you can shift an entire game or film development. When The Force Awakens didn't have plans for the First Order, that damned Battlefront 2. When EA wanted a cash cow to rival Overwatch, that damned Battlefront 2. It's really sad to think that this might have actually been a good game to rival the classic Battlefronts had it been given the freedom to spread its wings. I think it's perfectly fair to say that you enjoy Battlefront 2017. The game is sold for cheap pretty regularly, had its microtransactions removed, looks and sounds great, and still has players. But would I recommend it over Battlefront 2? Absolutely not. The game surprised me by not being the literal worst, But I was grinding the game out in the days ahead of my Skyrim video when I literally had nothing better to do, and then EA had a server outage, and I had to play the single-player instant action, and I just wasn't feeling it. The lack of meaningful single-player content is a problem. Galactic Conquest wasn't great by strategy game standards, but it is good enough to create a built-in justification for why the battles are taking place and why I should care about winning. The fact that it was decided, nah, we aren't even going to try to do that. In fact, let's go make Battlefront 2042 now. Yeah, imagine my lack of enthusiasm. Shout out to the patrons for funding this video. Your continued support keeps content like this independent. And this is probably going to be an EA double feature with what the next video is going to be.